I'd like to talk today a little bit about a research project I'd worked on for the last 7 years, as Bill mentioned in that introduction, tying together a number of different scientific disciplines to build a case around time travel as an explanation for the UFO phenomenon. Something many of you are familiar with since publishing this book. I've realized and come to meet a lot of people who have explored this same possibility in numerous ways, and it's been really interesting to get these different perspectives on essentially the same thing. So today I'll talk about my recently published book. Came out in March, and summarize sort of the different fields of study that help explain or possibly explain some major aspects of this phenomenon. So it looks at it in the context of our human descendants from the future returning from that future to study us in their own hominin evolutionary past. And what's important about this is that it is a testable model, being able to draw from evidence in order to back up a hypothesis versus simply speculating about things. And in my own research, I really make a solid attempt at not speculating about what sorts of things might contribute to our evolutionary form in the future, but rather draw from long-term evolutionary changes since we became upright walking hominids dating back 6 to 8 million years ago, when we branched off from the common ancestor of what would eventually be chimpanzees. And especially if we bring into the conversation numerous individuals that can contribute in different ways. Ufologists obviously have a lot to contribute, very deep knowledge of the different events that have taken place, the individuals, the research, very well positioned to contribute and continue to contribute a lot to an understanding. So my background is in anthropology. If we look at the last 6 to 8 million years of hominin evolution, there are a number of trends that have persisted throughout this time. And if the continuation of these trends, if they persist into the future, in many ways based on the characteristics or morphological traits and how those have trended over our previous 6 million years of existence, if they continued into the future, we are likely to possess a craniofacial form somewhat akin to this most commonly reported ET form. It's hard to imagine how we would communicate with other species that evolved on a very different planet with different morphology and so on and so forth. However, in the context of time travel, we would have access to information from the past, especially because we archive some of our most important parts of communication, books, and even digital records, and vice versa. We digitize analog records. So you can understand how it would be easier to learn a language of the past simply because you have access to these things. The Rosetta Stone is a great example. It allowed us to understand Egyptian hieroglyphics because we understood one of the languages of the three, and we happened to find the Rosetta Stone where 3 different languages, the same thing was written 3 different times, 3 different ways. We knew one of them, we could translate the other. So having access to those, even if they're very old, ancient records, still might allow us to get a deeper understanding of past forms of communication, past languages, whereas on other planets that might not be as accessible. So putting this together, looking at this most commonly described alien form, and obviously there are exceptions to this. There's the more reptilian, insect-like beings, Mothman, various cryptids and whatnot. But looking at the most commonly described alien form in the context of our own evolutionary history, first off, they're almost always described as having 2 arms and legs. And that's a trait that goes back 400 million years on this planet. Tetrapods, 4 limbs is simply what that means. Something else that goes along with that is pentatactyly, having 5 digits on each of your hands and feet. A very common characteristic here, also very commonly described in instances of close contact. But the most important one, in fact, the trait that defines our hominin lineage is bipedalism, upright walking. And like I've said 100 times, if these instances of close encounters, if these reports always described some 10-legged spider monster or a squid-like creature, I never would have written this book. I never would have done this research. But the fact that they're described as being upright walking the trait that defines our lineage, is a very important characteristic to consider, especially in the context of those exoplanetary statistics that I mentioned earlier. Big round heads. This is something that we have been developing for upwards of 4.5, 5 million years. Our brains have been getting bigger. I made the mistake of putting this in my suitcase on the way out here and then sitting on my suitcase, and there's a big old gap in there. Now I'm not sure I'm going to fix that, but when there's not a big gap from me sitting on my skulls, you can see that we've developed a big round neurocranium. In fact, that's one of the traits that defines anatomically modern Homo sapiens sapiens, our own specific time now. We are Homo sapiens sapiens. Neurocranial globularity is what we call that, a roundedness of the skull. The other one, in case you're curious, is a chin, what we call a mental eminence. We also have a chin, whereas you don't see that until our specific subspecies. Another is just the reduction of that face. The reason why we have a chin is because our face is retracted to the point where our teeth have gotten smaller and moved back, and now the bottom part of our jaw or mandible sticks out a little bit. We developed a chin simply because of the continuation of the same facial reduction and retraction that's taken place throughout hominin evolution. Two big eyes. Another very commonly described trait of these extratempestrials, as I call them, is big, giant eyes. And this is actually what I spent most of my time researching, is ocular anatomy. Observed more frequently during major historical events, the Foo Fighter phenomenon, other aspects of this phenomenon in which there's a big event happening at a specific time, or it's a place like the pyramids, Stonehenge, Karaahung, Machu Picchu. Even today, those places rank as some of the most visited tourist destinations in the world. People are innately fascinated by the past and the remnants of that past. Seeing these things in association with major events and major places, historic, prehistoric places especially, may indicate time tourism, that there's the desire, the demand to visit certain points in the past and see what people were doing, see what was going on at those times. And here you can also sort of think about it in the context of something that we're doing now. A lot of the space race now isn't about getting someone on the moon or getting someone to Mars. NASA's fledgling in its own right. But a lot of it's being done by private industry because they see a demand for taking very rich people into space. You can certainly understand how there would be a high demand, probably among very rich people who can afford it, to go into the past, to see their favorite time period. And you can all, I'm sure, think of, or you've probably already thought of, a specific time that you would want to visit if you had access to a time machine.